Okay, hello everyone. So for part one of this module, module 2, we're going to focus on what are setting events and how do they help explain behavior. In the first module, we talked about the three-term contingency and what that meant. We talked about the ABCs of behavior. Again, those are one and the same. And we defined what an antecedent was, what a behavior was, and what a consequence was. Today we're going to talk about the four-term contingency, which is effectively the same thing. We just add the term setting event to the front end of that three-term contingency. So let's walk through it. As a quick review from Module 1, let's talk about what the ABCs of behavior are. When someone says to you, what is an antecedent, you should at this point be able to say to them, it's the trigger. It's the event that comes right before the behavior that we're focusing on. From a definition standpoint, it's the stimulus that immediately precedes the behavior, or the behavior of concern. If someone were to say to you, what is a behavior, you should be able to say to them, it is the observable and measurable act of the individual. When we're speaking about consequences, you recall from Module 1 that we spoke about 4 different types of consequences. So consequences in this context are not just the bad things that come after a behavior. Instead, we're talking about the stimulus change that occurs immediately following that behavior. And if you'll recall, we talked about 4 different kinds of consequence conditions, both positive and negative, reinforcers and punishers. And you recall also as a review that we're able to qualify those as positive or negative, reinforcers or punishers, dependent on the relationship between the behavior and the consequence for that individual in that context across time. So today, we're going to move forward, and we're going to call this the four-term contingency, and we're going to add a new term called the setting event. Hopefully, after this module, you'll be able to discuss with colleagues what a setting event is. By definition, a setting event can happen at the same time or prior to an antecedent condition, and what it does is it temporarily alters the reinforcing value of the maintaining consequence. As you'll see on the screen here, we define it as an antecedent condition or event that temporarily alters the value of the consequence. So what that means, if you were to describe it to a colleague, is basically a student who you typically have in your classroom is going to perform differently given its typical trigger or an antecedent than they otherwise would. So our hope is if we can identify setting events, those events that happen that are unexpected, that are really outside of our control, if we can identify those, how can we most appropriately intervene and proactively implement strategies to support that student in our learning environment when we see them. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what a setting event is and how it relates to our three-term contingency. As previously mentioned, a setting event is an antecedent condition that temporarily alters the reinforcing value of the typical consequence for the student. As also previously mentioned, it can occur at the same time and or at a different time than the antecedent trigger. Here's an example of a setting event occurring at the same time. You may be sick or tired in school when given a task, which may decrease the value of a typical reinforcer for task completion and increase the value of a nap. An additional example of when a setting event can occur earlier in a different location than the antecedent trigger, if you fight with a family member before school, it may decrease the value of adult attention for appropriate social skills and increase the value of escape. In both of these circumstances, what we're seeing occur is a student responding differently than they typically would in that learning environment because of the presence of a setting event. Typically with setting events, 2 big takeaways. One is that a setting event is usually based off of a state of satiation or deprivation. And what that means is the student has either been exposed to too much of something or not quite enough of something. If we're able to identify that setting event effectively, again, the idea is can we identify a strategy that counteracts or counterbalances the state that child is in. Setting events may be environmental, physiological, or social, and they may help us explain variations of behavior, the behaviors that we're seeing with our students. For our purposes in this course, the term setting event and motivating operations, or MO, can be used interchangeably. Now let's see if we can define the difference between antecedents and setting events. An antecedent occurs immediately before the act and acts as a trigger for that problem behavior. So the relationship between the antecedent and the behavior is immediate and is apparent. They're connected directly. In contrast, a setting event indirectly sets up the problem behavior by temporarily altering the value of that maintaining consequence. Again, the setting event occurring either in conjunction with the antecedent condition, but I would say most likely prior to in a separate setting than that behavior occurring. Now let's take a look at 2 examples. The first example is titled Don. When Don's teacher gives him a difficult task, he engages in disruptive behavior. His teacher ignores his behavior and Don is able to avoid his task. Over time, he is more likely to engage in disruptive behavior when given a task. Don is especially likely to engage in disruptive behavior when he is tired. So please take a second, review this example, and see if you can identify if there is a setting event, and if so, what is it? At this point, hopefully you've had some time or taken some time to look through this example, and hopefully you've identified what you believe the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence are. Perhaps you've even been able to identify what that consequence is functioning as for that learner, and perhaps you've even been able to identify the setting event. Let's take a look at how we break this example down. So up top of your screen, you see the ABC sequence as well as the setting event box. We're going to look to identify what the action was and the effect on the behavior, and hopefully identify what the setting event is. So in this situation, the antecedent, or the trigger, is Don is given a difficult task. The behavior was Don exhibited or manifested disruptive behavior, of which we would be operationalizing for that student. In this scenario, the consequence is the teacher ignores his behavior and Don avoids his work. So when the question becomes, what was our action? The action was Don is avoiding more work, so we're taking away an aversive. The effect on Don's behavior is that he is more likely to engage in the disruptive behavior in the future. So the effect goes up. Now, what type of consequence condition is that? For taking something away and the effect is the behavior goes up in the future, we would call that negative reinforcement. We would then be able to say over time, if this was a consistent pattern, that the student's behavior is functioning to either escape or avoid that difficult or aversive work task. In this situation, there also is a setting event present. And that setting event is when Don is tired. When Don is tired, he is more likely to avoid the difficult task in order to escape it. Okay, good. Let's move on to a second example. This example is titled Brandi. During unstructured time with her peers, Brandi teases her peers. They tease her back and provide animated attention. In the future, Brandi continues to tease her peers. She's especially likely to engage in this behavior when she has spent the morning engaged in teacher-directed instruction and independent work. So take a moment again and see if you can identify the ABCs of behavior, the setting event, as well as the type of consequence condition that we're seeing here. Okay, so let's see what you came up with for the Brandi example. Here's a breakdown of the example. First, what was the antecedent? Hopefully you identified the antecedent here is unstructured time with her peers. Brandi's behavior is teasing behavior. The consequence should have been something to the effect of friends tease her back and provide her animated attention. Now, what was the action? The action was Brandi was provided with additional attention from her peers. What was the effect on behavior? In the future, Brandi is more likely to engage in the teasing behavior. Therefore, what type of consequence condition are we talking about here? Hopefully you came up with an answer of positive reinforcement. We could then say the function of this behavior for Brandi is to allow her to get or obtain peer attention. In this situation, was there a setting event? There was a setting event. And the setting event was that Brandi spent the morning engaged in teacher-directed instruction or independent work. So at this point, what we'll do is ask you to turn to your workbooks for activity 2.1. This is a stop and jot. Here, develop an example of a student with whom you've worked who exhibits problematic behaviors that you know are affected by a setting event. Look to include information about the behaviors and context, the ABCs, that follow that setting event. Once you've had a chance to do that, come on back here and we'll look to debrief this activity. I'll walk through a few other scenarios of setting events and what that ABC sequence looks like. Okay, welcome back. Let's do a quick debrief of activity 2.1 and review the idea of a setting event and what that might look like and how that might play into your students' everyday lives. Here I'm going to provide you a few additional examples of common setting events. So here, a pretty common setting event is a student comes to your school or starts the school day with lack of sleep the night before. In this situation, when the student is provided with independent math work, which on a more typical day for that student might not function as a trigger. In this situation, because of the lack of sleep, the student rips up their worksheet, and the consequence is they escape that work. They no longer have to complete that work, and they just sit at their desk for the remainder of that independent work time. Another example of a setting event is a student had an argument on the bus. A negative peer conflict occurred. something you had no awareness of potentially or control over. In this situation, the student is greeted by the teacher when they get off the bus, as they typically would to start a school day. And the student screams at the teacher and says, "Leave me alone." A behavior pattern you probably typically wouldn't expect from a student getting off the bus as they're starting their school day. However, in the presence of this setting event, they are more likely to be triggered by this greeting from the teacher. The consequence following that "leave me alone" statement is the student walks to class alone. A third example of a pretty common setting event is a student had a weekend away at a friend's house or a cousin's house, mom's house, dad's house, somebody's house. The student spent a weekend away from their typical routine, from their typical home environment, from their typical pattern of Saturdays and Sundays. In those situations, when your student comes to you that Monday morning, when they spent a weekend away at somebody's house, and you present them with a whole class mini lesson to get everybody grounded around the core concepts of the day, your student talks with peers around them. In this situation, they're talking with peers to gain attention. Another very common ABC sequence you might see in your room, particularly after long weekends away. As a final recap and reminder around setting events are those infrequent events that occur, they're outside of your control, that temporarily alter the reinforcing value of the maintaining consequence for your student in the environment that you're instructing them or interacting with them. Typically with setting events, we're talking about states of deprivation or satiation. The student has either not received enough of something or too much of something. So here, lack of sleep, the student has not received enough sleep. Therefore, they're coming to school already a bit agitated. Argument on the bus. In this situation, the student likely had been overexposed to negative peer attention. Therefore, if we walk through the ABC sequence, they walk to class alone because that functionally meets their needs. They just need some quiet time to reflect and debrief. And then finally, the weekend away. In this scenario, typically what that means for students is they've had lack of attention or social contact over the course of the weekend. So a state of deprivation, in other words. Therefore, this student functionally is looking for attention, and sure enough, they receive that in class based off of their behaviors. So now a quick preview of how to use all this information to guide our interventions. At this point, we've talked through what the ABCs of behavior are. We also talked about, just now, what a setting event is. The next big question and the takeaway is really, how do we use that knowledge to form and guide our interventions and our supports in the classroom? The idea and the hope is that we're able to come up with comprehensive and a continuum of strategies to best and most appropriately meet the behavioral needs of all of our students. And you'll see what we have here is a graphic that effectively boxes a series of different strategies for us to consider. First, up top, the setting event manipulations. You'll see here that we're able to come up with setting event strategies, and the hope there is to minimize the likelihood that the setting event will impact the student in the way that it currently is. This might include ways to add prompts or increase reinforcement for the desired behavior with the student. This might include systematically withholding the antecedent when the setting event is present for that student, or neutralizing the effect of the setting event during the situation that it occurs. The takeaway message with setting event strategies should be, how do we preventatively and proactively support the student when events occur in their lives outside of our control? Are we able to mitigate the effect of that setting event, neutralize its effect, or hopefully and ideally eliminate that setting event's effects? Moving forward and talking about antecedent manipulations, as you currently understand what an antecedent is, the next question becomes, how do we support students when we identify those triggers? A lot of the antecedent strategies we'll be talking about have to do with different types of prompts. And Jen will begin walking us through those types of prompts later in this module. The hope there is to make these problem behaviors irrelevant by, again, proactively providing support for that student. The middle box here, focusing on ways to teach behavior, has a lot to do with how do we explicitly and overtly identify for the student what are called replacement and desired behaviors and teach them specific strategies on how to more regularly exhibit those more appropriate behaviors. Jen today is going to talk to us about shaping and chaining strategies. But again, the big takeaway is how do we make the problem behavior for the student inefficient while simultaneously making the replacement or desired behaviors more efficient and effective for them. Finally, the final box is the consequence manipulations. And what we're going to be talking about there in subsequent modules is how do we establish a continuum of responses for both appropriate and inappropriate behaviors. How do we identify both reinforcing mechanisms as well as punishing strategies to meet the student's needs as they're exhibited. I'll be talking about that in future modules. Big takeaway from this slide, setting event and the A and the B strategies have a lot to do with proactive classroom management strategies, the elements we'll be focusing on in this module and moving forward. Consequence strategies are those strategies that occur and are implemented following the manifestation of a behavior, a good behavior, an appropriate behavior, or an inappropriate behavior. So these are more reactionary classroom management strategies and supports that we will also be talking about. By understanding the function of a student's behavior, we're able to intervene more effectively, and that is your take-home idea. So if we're able to understand the ABC sequence, the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences, and we're able to reliably measure those behaviors over time, we can hopefully come up with effective, well-informed strategies to both prevent the behavior from happening, teach the student more appropriate replacement behaviors, and train and support our staff on how to respond most effectively when both good and inappropriate behaviors occur. We hope that we can make simple tweaks and informed tweaks to the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences to both prevent, teach, as well as respond to behaviors as they occur. Let's take a look at what this might look like, and it's kind of going to be a preview for you on what this will look like in our conversations in subsequent modules. During teacher lecture, Martha repeatedly and loudly calls out without raising her hand. Each time the teacher gives her a look, a redirection, or occasionally calls on her. Think to yourself for a minute, are there ways that you could implement strategies to prevent this situation from occurring? Are there support or strategies you can put into place to help support teaching Martha about her behavior and more appropriate behaviors? Are there also consequence strategies that you could look to implement with Martha to improve this behavior over time? You may have said that one way to support Martha is to provide her attention ahead of lecture as well as frequent eye contact during lecture. This will, in a preventative way, provide Martha the attention she's looking for because we do know, in fact, her function is to obtain that attention. So we're trying to give it to her before the behavior occurs. When it comes to teaching behavior, we might implement and identify strategies that allow us to teach and prompt Martha to raise her hand. As we'll note up here, she is currently not raising her hand, which is a behavior we want to extinguish. One way to do that is to teach her a more appropriate replacement behavior, a behavior that will serve for Martha the same maintaining function. It will allow her to get the attention she deserves in a more appropriate way. So to do that, a behavior-based strategy might be to teach her explicitly how to raise her hand during lecture. Finally, consequence strategies might look at calling on her only when she raises her hand. And otherwise, we're just going to ignore Martha's inappropriate behaviors. Okay, so let's look at an example or a series of strategy examples that you may have come up with on your own. First, what type of antecedent strategy might you come up with to prevent this behavior from happening for Susanna? You may have come up with the idea that you might look to modify her writing assignment, thereby making it less of an aversive for her and more accessible to her. When it comes to teaching strategies, you may have identified that you want to work in strategies that help teach and prompt Susanna to ask for help or a break. Again, teaching her to ask for a break will be considered a replacement behavior, a behavior you hope in the future she's more likely to use instead of her current inappropriate behavior in order to get the same outcome or the same maintaining consequence. Finally, when we talk about consequence strategies, how do we respond to Susanna's behavior? You may have said we want to give her immediate help or a break when she asks it. In other words, when she exhibits her replacement behavior, we're going to immediately respond and allow her to escape. Otherwise, we may talk about strategies that help to redirect Susanna when she continues to exhibit her inappropriate behavior. Let's look at one final example. In the hallway with peers, Tim often teases, trips, or pushes a student who talks and walks a little slower than others. Each time, Tim's peers laugh and pat him on the back. Take a moment to yourself and see if you can identify at least one antecedent strategy or one strategy to help prevent this behavior from occurring. See if you can identify one behavior strategy, one way to teach Tim a more appropriate behavior, as well as at least one consequence-based strategy. Hopefully you've had some time at this point to look over strategies and consider strategies either with yourself or with those in your group. One example for an antecedent-based strategy here with Tim may be to increase prompts and active supervision in the hallway, the very setting where he's having and exhibiting these challenging behaviors. One behavior-based strategy may be to work in ways to teach and prompt him of respectful behavior towards all peers across all settings. Finally, a consequence strategy may be something called a group contingency. And the idea of group contingencies and what their variations entail will be discussed at greater detail in future modules when we talk about a continuum of procedures to reinforce appropriate behavior. A group contingency is a reinforcement-based strategy by which we might reinforce peers for exhibiting appropriate behavior and for prompting Tim away from his current inappropriate behavior. So we'll talk much more about group contingencies, but the idea of a group contingency may play in well nicely given this context in the hallway. Now, as we wrap up part 1 of Module 2, and before Jen takes over, just one final slide to talk about non-examples of function-based approaches. Again, as we talk about function, we talk about what underlying mechanism drives a student to behave in a certain way in a certain environment. If we're able to identify reliably the function of that behavior, we will be able to effectively identify strategies to support that student moving forward. So first, in the top right, in the orange box, we have Jasper. I'm taking your book away because you obviously aren't ready to learn. In this situation, Jasper may be acting out in order to what? Escape the book, escape that aversive. So by taking away that book from Jasper, potentially what we're doing as a teacher is inadvertently reinforcing the future likelihood of that inappropriate behavior. So that would be an example, or a non-example, of a function-based approach. Second example, the blue box. Quincy, you skipped 2 days of school, so we're going to suspend you for 2 more. Again, in this scenario, what we're looking to do is extinguish the behavior of skipping school. Instead, what we've done is potentially reinforce the student's behavior by providing them with negative reinforcement. We've eliminated school, the aversive, from the student's life, thereby potentially increasing the future likelihood that this behavior of skipping will only increase rather than what we intend, which is decrease. And finally, the bottom green box. You want my attention? I'll show you attention. Let's take a walk down to the office and have a little chat with the principal. In this scenario, the student, in all likelihood, did something in the classroom to warrant the teacher's negative attention. In this scenario, the teacher's perspective is likely that they're providing positive punishment. In all likelihood, the teacher is also assuming that walking the student down to the office is going to provide them with additional positive punishment. In all actuality, for this student, the idea of any attention, positive or negative, may be functioning in a reinforcing way. So in this scenario, from the student's perspective, they may be seeing what is hopefully is being intended to be positive punishment as actually positive reinforcement. When the teacher walks that child down to the main office where they're met with additional adult attention, that may also be perceived by the student as positive reinforcement. Effectively, over time, all of these scenarios are working against us in the classroom and in our schools. Again, underscoring the importance of looking at what is the true function of the child's behavior, again, based on the context of the behavior's occurrence and based on the student's behavior patterns across time. We need to identify the function in order to identify effective strategies.